Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight, our third webinar in our series, Space Exploration, an Update for Earthlings. I'm really excited. I'm so glad we have these wonderful speakers with us. My name is Michelle Maloney. I'm the co-founder and national convener of the Australian Earth Laws Alliance, or AELA. And I'm very pleased to do some introductory comments this evening, and then I'll be introducing our wonderful guests. So first of all, I'll just quickly share screen. So an update for Earthlings. We're in webinar 3, but welcome everyone. So we started earlier this week in our series. On the 19th of July, we had a webinar on plans for the Moon and Mars. And we heard about the remarkable plans people have, both nation states and private companies to go to the Moon, and lots of plans for expeditions to Mars. Yesterday, we talked about what impact space exploration might have on the Moon and beyond. And it was a really fascinating conversation. This evening then is how should we govern space exploration? And we're very pleased to have this as our third and final part of our discussions this week, because this issue has popped up in all of the other sessions as well. The Australian Earth Laws Alliance is hosting this webinar series. We were created about 10 years ago as a response to the climate and ecological crises by a group of lawyers who were very inspired by the ideas of creating deep systems change across our governance and law systems. So today we work to increase the understanding and practical implementation of Earth-centered governance. And our focus is on law, economics, education, ethics, creativity, and supporting and advocating the remarkable Indigenous knowledge systems in Australia and across the world. We're a not-for-profit organisation. We're not a think tank. We're not a do tank. We're a bit of a think and do space. And we've got a strong focus on building community and civil society capacity to help folks do good regenerative work in our society. We're interconnected with a whole range of other networks around Australia. And if you're not familiar with our work, please look us up. And as an Australian organisation, I wanted to make sure that we acknowledge country. This is a really important and growing tradition in Australia. Australia was colonised by the British Empire in 1788, and there's never been a treaty. Aboriginal people never gave up their country. And so more and more, as the growing awareness across this continent of the remarkable ancient culture and all of the different, what some folks today might call nation states, as that emergence in non-Indigenous communities continues to grow, paying our respects to Indigenous elders past, present and emerging, and the remarkable Indigenous culture across this continent, and the debt that we all owe to their caring for country and caring for each other, which has built the foundations of their ongoing culture and our emergent civilization. And I should say that I live, work and play on the traditional lands of the Yagara and Turrbal peoples here in North Brisbane. And anyone who's an Australian in our audience, feel free to say g'day on the chat and acknowledge country wherever you are. So before I introduce our speakers, I always think it's handy to tell people, why is the Australian Earth Laws Alliance interested in space exploration? So AELA, excuse me, AELA is interested in how we can care for life on Earth and how we interact with the wider universe and cosmos. One of the many branches of knowledge that we're inspired by is Earth jurisprudence, and the work of Thomas Berry and many other deep ecologists has looked at really the remarkable gift that is our emerging cosmos. And so humanity's potential plans for the Moon will have a direct impact on us, Earthlings, all across this beautiful, amazing rock floating in space, spinning in space. But our plans to explore Mars also raise a range of ethical and other issues for us to consider. So basically, and I think I said this the other day, as an organisation, we're interested in wherever humanity goes, how do we care for the place? How do we look after things? How do we not trash the joint? And in our case, as an individual, I'm also really passionate about our beautiful Moon. I'm like many of you, all of you, I hope, From the moment I could look up into the world, I've been admiring the moon and seeing it as a constant companion, a great big ball of shiny gorgeousness, really one of our evolutionary companions for sure. So to stimulate discussion about and to hopefully get wider engagement in these issues about humanity's obligations to care for the rest of the cosmos as we march about and try to find other things in it, we're part of the drafting process of the Declaration for the Rights of the Moon, which Alice and I might talk about a bit more later. If you haven't seen it, please read it. It's really beautiful. And it's all about stimulating a conversation to say, what right do we have to even go to the moon, let alone settle on it, mine it, take its water supplies, or generally mess it up? And how do we think about the moon in such a way that we have deep respect for its ongoing existence? So we've been hosting these webinars to stimulate conversations, and we're super keen to do this at least once a year to celebrate International Moon Day, which I don't know if I mentioned yesterday's webinar. This year, and Alice can talk more about it, this year is the very first International Day of the Moon to celebrate when man first invaded the moon. So that's about it from me. What I wanted to say is we've had some amazing speakers so far, and I'm now going to hand over to my wonderful colleague and co-conspirator in organising these webinars, Alice Gorman, to introduce our speakers tonight. So thank you so much, and over to you, Alice.
Thank you, Michelle, and we truly are excited to have this lineup of outstanding international scholars and thinkers in the field of what we do in space. So our first speaker tonight will be Irina Chernyk, followed by Blethen Bowen, and then Chris Newman, and hopefully Dean Sanders if he's able to join us. Everyone's going to talk for about 10-15 minutes, and this will then be followed by plenty of opportunities for people to ask questions. And as Michelle said, we ask you to pop them into the chat. So I'd first of all like to welcome Irina, ask her if you'd like to start sharing your slides. So Irina is a senior lecturer in the International Space Law Center at Rudyn University in Moscow. She's also a member of the International Institute of Space Law. And with me, she's an expert member of the Global Expert Group for Sustainable Lunar Activities, which is currently producing a document to present to the United Nations Committee on the Peaceful Use of Outer Space, which we hope might make a difference to how people do things on the moon in the future. And her contributions to this document have been an absolutely key part of how we're thinking about this. So welcome, Irina, and the floor is yours.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much, Alice. Thank you very much, Michelle. Dear friends, dear colleagues, I hope you can see my presentation now. First of all, I would like to thank again Alice, Michelle for the kind invitation to participate in this event dedicated to the first International Moon Day and to discuss some of very important aspects of the future exploration and use of outer space, of the lunar exploration. And for me, it's a big privilege and a big opportunity to talk once more about international legal basis of the use and exploration of the natural satellite of our Earth, the Moon. And in this context today, I decided to focus my report more on the Moon Agreement 1979 and future perspectives of the lunar activities regulations. So anyway, first of all, I should start from the short overview of the current norms which we have today and which we can apply to regulate lunar activities. Secondly, I will pay more attention on the Moon Agreement 1979. And finally, I will show you different variants of how lunar activities can be regulated. You know, for me, as an international lawyer, it's very important to start with the basis of international legal regulation and of the exploration and use of outer space and other celestial bodies. On the slide, you can see the chart dedicated to the instrument on regulation of the peaceful uses of outer space. And here, undoubtedly, to say that the Magna Carta and a foundation of the regulation of all space activities is the Outer Space Treaty. It contains specialized principles of international space law, such as non-appropriation principle, responsibility for space activities, or that exploration and use of outer space is the province of all mankind. As you can see on the slide, the Outer Space Treaty is a basis for regulation of all space activities, and of course, it regulates lunar activities. Some of its provisions have been detailed in the subsequent future international treaties, like the Rescue Agreement, the Liability Convention, the Registration Convention, or the Moon Agreement. The OST also open and is a basis for the soft law documents, and it opened a window for the following drafting of national space legislation, which have been started drafting since 60s, 70s years of last century. Also, it is a basis for all bilateral and multilateral international treaties, for the charters of international intergovernmental organizations, and for non-governmental initiatives. De facto, all these documents touch upon the topic of the lunar exploration and lunar activities. You know, we even tried to list all such kind of instruments in the document, which we prepare with my colleagues of the GEXLA, with Alice in the framework of the drafting group. But we realized that nowadays there are so many different instruments which we can use in different situations. Some of them binding, some of them non-binding, but the common understanding of all of us was and is that Outer Space Treaty is a basis, and that we have the only one universal international treaty on celestial issues, which is the Moon Agreement. And here I have to say some words about the Moon Agreement, 1979. So, if everyone opens any article or scientific article, I mean, on the Moon Agreement, in most cases, he will find a lot of criticism, first of all, of this agreement, such as that there are only 18 state parties to this treaty, or that Article 11 has the very controversial concept of common heritage of mankind, or that this agreement is not applicable in practice, or that again the concept of common heritage of mankind was used for the UNCLOS 1982 and is required to be detailed and reviewed for space activities, or again that this agreement was drafted in different time period, and that period is similar with UNCLOS conferences. Yes, it's true, but why do we always see and look at the negative sides. Despite maybe problems which we have with the Moon Agreement, we also have very useful provision of this international treaty. For instance, first of all, this international treaty has specialized mechanisms for its revision and concretization of disputable Article 11. Moreover, to use it, we only need the will of states parties of this agreement. Last but not least, this agreement has very useful provisions such as freedom of scientific exploration or the protection of environment of the Moon, and so on. And I think that this agreement is a very good basis for future application in practice and for the lunar activities. After that, I would like to concentrate your attention. What is the problems? What are obstacles for the revision of the Moon Agreement? Why do we need to reinvent the wheel? While at the same time, we have the applicable international treaty. You know, there are several factors in the world, and some of them are the following. It is subject composition of participants, which has been changed recent years. More states, more private actors, commercialization of space activities, changes in the world politics and economy, more soft law instruments, less hard law instruments, use of digital internet technologies, challenges of 21st century like COVID-19, global warming, etc., etc., etc. Yes, we live in difficult time, but in the meanwhile, it is very interesting period from the point of international law view, who is specialized in space law. Why? Because regulation of space activities, if we remind one of my first slides, regulation of space activities became from international level. Outer space has international legal regime, and so many actors are interested in this sphere due to scientific, commercial, and other purposes. It is a unique area for the international cooperation and for peaceful competition at the same time. Moon is the first candidate where humanity will be able to start long-term manned programs. Moon historically and naturally binds with the Earth. It is strategic location for the future exploration of deep space. It is unique opportunity to explore our universe from the surface of the Moon and explore the Moon as a part of our human being. So what kind of perspectives do we have in this context from the international legal point of view? So just looking at the next slide, it is like a chat. And to regulate lunar activities, first of all, I suggest to look at the hard regulation of lunar activities. And of course, it will be international treaties. The first international treaty is the Moon Agreement. And what kind of variants do we have here? The first variant is to use the Moon Agreement and to use it through current state parties to the Moon Agreement. use Article 11 and Article 18, which suggests to draft international legal regime for resource exploration. The second variant dealing with the Moon Agreement is to use Article 17, which opens opportunity to propose amendments to the Moon Agreement. Again, it will have to do states parties to the Moon Agreement. But how? The first variant, which we can find in the doctrine, in the different literature, it is to draft an operating agreement. And nowadays we have the project, Space Treaty Project, which suggests a model implementation agreement for the Moon Treaty. The second variant here can be to draft annex, just annex to the Moon Agreement, or to the third variant is to revise the whole Moon Agreement. The second variant, if we look at the international treaties, it is a story when states will be able to draft a new international universal treaty. How states will be able to do it? Of course, the use of the platform of UN Corpus, who member states, and what we have nowadays. Nowadays, under the UN Corpus umbrella, we have separate agenda item, general exchange of views on potential legal models for activities in exploration, exploitation, and utilization of space resources. Last year, the separate working group on this topic was established. This work on the narrow topic like resource utilization has already been started. But the second variant, how we can use UN Corpus, we also, we states can also think about initiatives to draft not only like separate document dedicated to the space resources utilization, but to think about like in general to draft a comprehensive new international universal treaty on lunar exploitation and lunar activities. Dear colleagues, do you see my low or
yes, we can
row?
see it, Irina.
Yeah, great. Because I see the like additional panel, and I'm worried about that you don't see. You see, okay, great. And the third variant is to use additional states can use bilateral and multilateral international treaties, which will be applied in the framework of separate space projects. Nowadays, we have already had an example like Artemis Accords, which has 21st member state. Again, I would like to highlight that some of the states' initiatives nowadays only are dedicated to the space resources utilization. So, last but not least, what can we use more? It is soft law regulation. If you look at the slide, you can see that there are numerous variants and different instruments that are actively used in practice today. I can say that soft law is very helpful and useful mechanism for the regulation of space activities in spite of its non-binding characteristics. The process of drafting some principles has already been started. As I mentioned before, it has already begun under the UN Corpus umbrella. Additionally, there are many non-governmental initiatives which are used for the activities and work of the UN Corpus. Here I would like to pay your attention on non-governmental initiatives. We have already had some initiatives dedicated to, again, to the resource exploration, like HAC International Space Resources Governance Working Group. We have very important and comprehensive documents which were drafted and are being drafted under the Moon Village Association umbrella. International Institute of Space Law can prepare different position papers in this regard. Unfortunately, as we again can see that UN Corpus, if we talk about this platform, nowadays does not talk about comprehensive document dedicated to the lunar activities or lunar exploration, which will be able to cover different aspects of this direction. The other story, how can we use soft law regulation, on what kind of organization can suggest this soft law regulation? It is international standards, technical or scientific standards. Today we have International Standardization Organization, CASPAR guidelines, and so on. Finally, the regulation of lunar activities through the regulation of national activities, of course, should be done at the national level. Here we have some good examples of national space regulation. Again, these examples are in the sphere of space resources utilization. Today we have at least 4 states which have already drafted its national laws dedicated to space resource utilization, but I believe that in the future more states will think about drafting separate and specialized national space legislation dedicated not only to space resource utilization, but in general to the different aspects of future lunar use, lunar activities, such as, for instance, environmental protection again, or mitigation of space debris on the surface of the moon, or, for instance, protection of human heritage, space heritage on the surface on the moon, and so on. To conclude, we can see that today, if we talk about regulation of lunar activities, today and tomorrow we will have a complex regulation of this type of space activities. I believe that humanity states or maybe private entities, if we talk about national level, will apply in combination international hard and soft law documents and incorporate they will incorporate this norms provision, for instance, of hard law or soft law instruments, international space legislation. And this complex mechanism will give us the opportunity to regulate lunar activities in a comprehensive way, and it's very important. Additionally, on the slide, you can see some useful links for additional readings, some materials in Russian, but I can say here that if you are interested in international legal regulation of lunar activities or of space activities in general, there are lots of materials on this topic, and you can easy to find it in the internet or to find some open materials like handbooks and books or scientific articles. At the end, I can say that that what is happening now is, I think, no less important for the future of the world space activities in comparison with the launching of Sputnik 1 or the flight of the first man into outer space, Yuri Gagarin. I believe we are witnessing a new era of space activities, of lunar exploration, and this process will go down in the history of all mankind. And for us, there are many opportunities how we will do it, with what mechanisms we will do it. And I think to use and to open our universe, our moon, today we have all mechanisms. We just have to apply in a right way these norms, these treaties, soft law documents, and we will be able together on the basis of international cooperation to explore the moon and to find new horizons. Thank you very much for your attention. If you have any questions, I will be happy to answer at the end of our evening's webinar. Thank you very much again.
Thank you so much, Irina. It's often said that outer space is like the Wild West, but I think you've shown us some of the very interesting kind of intersections and interlockings of different kinds of soft and hard international law. And of course, Australia, as a state party to the Moon Agreement, I like to think I'm not the only fan of the Moon Agreement who's in the room right now. Thank you so much for that illuminating journey through the relationship between those instruments. I'd like to ask our next speaker now, who is Associate Professor Blevin Bowen from the University of Leicester. He's an expert in international relations and space policy, and in particular, the militarization of space. And I'm sure he won't mind if I give a plug to his just about to be released book called Original Sin, Power, Technology and War in Outer Space. Over to you, Blevin.
Hi, Alice. Hi, everyone. Thanks very much for the introduction, and thanks for the book plug. That's very kind of you. As Alice mentioned, my background is in international relations and war studies. So that is the approach I take to outer space. So very much on the politics and warfare side rather than legal or scientific or engineering. So I don't have any slides for you today. So I will just talk through just a few points I've written down in preparation, and hopefully they'll make some sense, and hopefully they'll be short and sweet. I don't think I'll need the whole 15 minutes, but I may get overexcited and then use up all that time all the same. I think when it comes to questions of how do we govern ourselves in space, as widely speaking, for me, the big question I think we need to have some good answer to before we even get to that question is, why are we going to places like the moon? And by we, it's usually a specific state or a specific organization that is doing it. And why are they doing that? And that is not unique to the moon. It is the same question that is leveled at, say, the International Space Station. Why is that necessary? Now, this is not to say that I don't think the ISS or lunar exploration aren't worth doing. It's just that I think that there's a lot of debate and uncertainty around why is so much money being spent on this, and are those goals worthwhile? And one of the arguments I make in the forthcoming book is that the phrase that is in some of the legal texts that we've just heard about, and I know Chris especially will take me to task if I get this wrong later. There's the phrases being thrown around such as the common heritage of mankind, or for the benefit of everyone, quite universal language, and the equitable distribution clauses of Article 11 of the Moon Treaty, that sort of human universalist language, I think disguises a reality that space programs happen for specific people and their specific interests that are often self-interested. They're not universalist, because there are always some people who benefit from spending vast amounts of money on any such massive scientific or engineering project. So this is not unique to space. It's just that space is like any other massive technological project, and it is political because some people benefit a lot from it. Now, whether that's the contractors that build the systems, the political leaders that get all the kudos, or if it's the wider state and society that then develop new economic or technological resources that they can then draw upon in the years to come. So when we talk about governing the moon, for example, well, why are we going there? What activities are we, say, the international community, actually interested in regulating? Because it's not entirely clear what the future of the moon actually is practically going to involve. At the moment, there are no there are no military or economically significant aspects to the moon. It's very expensive to get there. We don't really know if there's anything of actual economic value there that we can actually make practical use of. Yes, theoretically, there's potential resources, but again, our understanding of the moon itself is still very, very poor. So whether things would be able to be exploited is still a question mark at this point. I'm not saying no, it'll never happen. It's just that there are big question marks over the practical uses of the moon. So we have to think about what potential futures are for the moon. And you have to think not just in terms of the economic viability of whatever it is you want to do on the moon, but also whether long-term habitation is possible as well. And for anyone who follows activities on the International Space Station very closely, you'll know how difficult it is to sustain 6 people just in low Earth orbit on an indefinite basis, and how expensive that is. So we have to think about what the futures are in terms of, can people stay there for a long time, and can any significant economic returns come from it? Because lots of money have to be spent on this. What exactly are the returns? It's not we're not wanting, no government is going to want a black hole in terms of financial questions and spending. So there has to be a tangible return to it. And I don't think a lot of big proponents of a future on the moon have persuasively argued that, and even less so for Mars, which is another kettle of fish. So I think because depending on where you fall on the habitability and economic viability questions, you have the more fantastical visions of new habitats on the moon that start developing their own manufacturing economy. So people can live there, people can make money and trade things. That's one possible vision. But another one is people can live there for very long, and there's actually nothing of practical value there that you can actually exploit for any meaningful economic return. So that's when you get short-term scientific or exploration expeditions, or perhaps something that actually resembles adventure tourism, like Everest or K2, and looking at the way those industries haven't looked after the environments there, and the political economy of those industries, those aren't particularly positive futures either for a place like the moon. So those are potential visions, and I don't know what the future is, but it's those differing ideas of what the moon is for and why do we want to go in the first place, and then shape what the governance is about, because they have different stakes and different levels of importance. So if there's going to be an international sort of tourism business on the moon, because there's nothing else there other than people who just want the thrill of going to the moon and back for a couple of days, that is a very different kind of governance regime that you'll need for perhaps mineral exploitation on the moon. Or are we just going to have a few scientific outposts like McMurdo Station on Antarctica on the moon? And is it just about facilitating the everyday activities of a few hundred people on different science stations who are there for a few months at a time? So, and those are very different visions for the future. Or are we going to have something that resembles oil rigs in the sea, where people go and work there on a rotational basis, and they come and go, and there has to be some sort of mechanism for that. So the governance regime really depends on why, what is there, what are you going to be doing there? And until we figure that out, it's very difficult, I think, to get very practical international treaties or norms or regulation that really get into detail, because we have to figure out what it is people are actually going to be doing there. So in the time I have left, I think I'll just talk a bit about my pessimism for the future, sadly, but that is drawing from reality in terms of how we are already doing things in Earth orbit. So not in every discussion. So as we heard from Irene earlier, what we might want to do beyond Earth is already being determined by the space law regimes that are in place now that govern Earth orbit. But a lot of other discussions talk about governance on Mars or the moon or beyond, without actually looking at how we do things in Earth orbit in space today and for the past 50, 60 years. And the reality is, in Earth orbit, there are supreme military and economic interests in the governance and the use of satellites in Earth orbit. So telecoms, satellite navigation, Earth observation or intelligence gathering from space, and the military and economic infrastructure that are those satellites in Earth orbit. They are governed by a regime that allows all the states of the international system to pursue almost any interest that they want that fulfills military, economic, and political needs because of the importance of that environment. It doesn't prevent hostile action between member states of the UN if they want to do such things, because they can just say it's self-defense, Article 51, or perhaps just use interventionist language. So in space, in Earth orbit right now, states have a pretty free hand to do what they think is in their supreme interest, because Earth orbit is of supreme military and economic importance. Now, the moon isn't there yet. The moon isn't militarized because there's nothing of military importance there, and there won't be for a very long time. I get very frustrated when some military personnel start talking about what their military service can do to help develop cislunar or lunar infrastructure, when it's like, why are you doing this? Your business is in Earth orbit. There's no military activity beyond Earth of any significance. But if the moon becomes economically valuable and exploitable, then you will have the military interests extend to protect those investments, and that is when you start extending what is the political, military, economic regime of Earth orbit now beyond and towards the moon. If the moon becomes something that is militarily and economically important. And if you look at the way the International Telecommunications Union already apportions finite orbital resources such as geostationary orbital slots or radio frequency spectrum, it is a first come, first served basis. And the equitable provisions for developing states is quite minimal, especially, well, it's very minimal according to developing states themselves, who find it quite an oppressive regime for their own development through space technology. So if the ITU and the way we've already started to apportion out orbital resources in Earth, which very much satisfy the older, more established space powers of Europe, US, Russia, former Soviet Union, Japan, China, and India, it doesn't augur well for the future of the moon if it becomes militarily and economically significant. So, so if you want to do better on the moon, I think you have to learn from what's happened already in Earth orbit and how the moon could be different there. And also, I guess I'll just finish, and this again may just line me up for criticism from Chris, maybe. But I think we have to remember that international law is an expression of international politics. It's not a solution to politics. It is politics. So international law is not something you should just try and build to solve what you think is a political problem. It's part of the political process and is an expression of political will as well. So for me, international law is politics, and law is, I think, or an international treaty is what happens at the end of often a long, tortuous political process. And even then, it's not the end. It just changes the political situation then, and you have a treaty to build on. And with the Outer Space Treaty, I think it's a foundation that is not going to go away, and we'd be much worse off if we ever lose the Outer Space Treaty. And we should see it as a framework for further development, with or without the Moon Treaty, perhaps, but that's a topic for the Q&A. Thanks very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Gavin. And even though you said you were going to end on a very pessimistic note, personally, I'm extremely heartened that you don't see the moon and cislunar space as a target for military activities in the short term. So that's actually, and I have exactly as you say, I have heard people from defence in different parts of the world talking as if this is already set in stone. So it's actually extremely positive that from your perspective as an expert in the field, we don't have to worry about this just yet. So I'd like to move on to our third speaker for the webinar. Professor Christopher Newman from Northumbria University in the UK. He's a member of the International Institute of Space Law and also the British Interplanetary Society, and regularly provides commentary on space policy and space law to the BBC and other media forms in Europe. And he's also one of the most creative thinkers in this field that I know. So I'm very pleased to give the floor over to him. Chris, if you would like to share your screen.
You are always too kind to me, Alice, and it's absolutely lovely to be here. Greetings from the northeast of England to everybody who's listening. And yeah, it's almost like this was planned. It's brilliant, because what I'm going to do is I'm going to build on Irina and Blethin's discussions and talk about new models of space governance and areas that I think will work together and areas that I think we might have to let go. I've just knocked my microphone, hang on. I am a sort of unusual in the field, in that I wouldn't identify myself as a card-carrying international lawyer. I'm a constitutional lawyer. So I'm interested in the building blocks of a constitution and what makes institutions tick, what makes governance tick. So I'm going to talk about that. I will just say that the comments and views are my own. Don't represent any organization that I might have been affiliated with or associate with. This is my thinking. But I'm going to talk us through a broad discussion on governance. Now, I'm going to start by quoting P.G. O'Rourke, the Republican commentator, who said that when people talk about law and order, they're not really interested in the law. They're interested in the order. And I think that's kind of one of the things that we need to embrace, that the law, as kind of Blethin was saying, the law is the end product and the end of the end of the discussion, rather than, as we sometimes see in space circles, pass a law and then people will do things. It doesn't work like that. I'm not a great fan of talking about space law anyway. I rather think in terms of governance, and I'm glad we're framing the discussion in terms of governance. Formal, informal arrangements by which stable practices and organizations arise and persist. So there's the order that we're talking about. And of that, laws, regulations, mechanisms, guidelines, norms, all of these type of things put into the governance of human activity. Not necessarily in space, this is a broad sort of theory of governance, but I do think that we need to start thinking in bigger terms than just law, because at the minute, we're getting lost in the long grass here. Firstly, I will sort of start off by saying we're not ready to address the constitutional questions in respect of the moon, the organized power structures, what rights people may have on the moon, we're not even close. As Blethyn said, the infrastructure is just not there. We're looking at the struggles that the United States, the superpower, has in trying to get a rocket to the moon. Right? They're spending a lot of money on this, and just getting there is really difficult. We can't start thinking about habitation yet. There's no infrastructure in place. So really thinking about the type of activities that we're going to regulate, the way we're going to regulate them, all of this type of stuff, the old military phrase, no sort of plan survives first contact with the enemy. And it's going to be the same with the moon. No sort of predictive governance model is going to survive the first contact with the infrastructure, with the difficulties and with the problems that are there. So kind of we need to think about a value system. That's, I think, the most important thing. That's why I'm so pleased to be here. That's why I'm so pleased to be talking with you, because this type of conversation and the type of conversations that are going on around the world at the minute is absolutely imperative. If we're going to start thinking about governing the moon, we need to go back to the first question that was asked. Well, okay, what do we want that to look like? And the only way we can answer what that looks like is by establishing the shared values that that exploration is going to have. Now, this is the time for me to be pessimistic, and it doesn't fall naturally to me. I'm not a pessimist by nature. But at the minute, you only have to look at the international situation. You only have to look at geopolitics. As a great writer once said, what happens in space is a reflection of terrestrial politics. That was Blethyn's first book, by the way. And so I think at the minute, agreement, consensus, the price is very high. Finding those shared values is very difficult. That's why the Outer Space Treaty is such an essential trunk of international space law, because it's something that we all agree with. And it shapes those horizontal relationships we have between states. There is no way to get enforcement at the minute, as we know, again, from the international situation. There is no vertical relationship. There's no hierarchy of states where the state at the top can demand the state at the bottom does something. Well, we see the consequences of that anyway. And are we looking for a divine architect to wave their magic wand and produce a governance solution that's equitable to everyone? Or are we going to get a much more ugly, but ultimately much more reliable, persistent, and enduring governance solution through evolution? And I think that's what we need to accept, that the process might be a bit messy. So there are wicked problems that are associated with lunar governance. Now, these wicked problems are no different to any other sort of tech areas that we're seeing at the minute. The problems that I'm identifying here are very, very similar to the discussions we're having in the cyber realm, in the realm of AI. This is, we need to explore, and we need to break out of the space bubble as well to find out what these other areas are doing to try and deal with these issues. So the first thing we've got, as Irina did a brilliant exposition of current international law, and saved you all from me having to explain it. There's no legally binding environmental protection of the space environment in the Outer Space Treaty. Yes, you could argue that Article 9 provides little bits and pieces, but a substantive environmental provision, nah. So we know that Earth is a wonderfully resilient planet. I mean, I live in the northeast of England with a rich mining heritage. And if you drive through some of the villages where I live, you can't see that because nature's taken over. There's grass and there's hills and there's things where mines and pit faces used to be. The moon doesn't have that. We start strip mining the moon, that scar tissue of human activity is going to be there, livid, for all to see, for all time. Okay. And as I say, we don't know the type of infrastructure that's going to be needed for this commercial activity, for the scientific activity. If there is to be any military activity, we don't know what it's going to look like. That leads to uncertainty. And then, yes, we've got the question of lunar resources. And I've broken this down into two sort of areas. I agree with Blethyn. I think commercially, I'm going to be long dead by the time it might be commercially viable to mine the moon. But there's the very real issue of in situ resource utilization. Living light, traveling light and living off the land. That's what we need to do to get to the moon. Certainly, that's what we'll do to need to go to Mars. But that then means we've got the first come, first served problem. And I noticed a question in the chat from Alice about the common heritage principle. I'll talk a little bit about that later on if I get time. But I also think that we need to be mindful when we're talking about lunar governance. When the Artemis Accords were discussed, and I'm going to come on and talk about the Artemis Accords, the NASA administrator said, well, this is going to be a template moving forward for humans going into the solar system. Now, I would challenge that because the moon has a unique relationship to humanity. As much as we might want to deny it, it's our celestial sibling. It's there. People write songs about it. People fall in love underneath moonlight. People worship the moon. We can't deny that it's the same as the others. It's not. It's part of us. And we need to accept that. Now, that's part of the conversation and that's part of the discussion. When I say about space law, I say we need shared values on this, and we really need a conversation around the relationship we have with the moon. And again, as I say, that's why I'm so pleased to be here now. I'm not going to waste time on this slide. It's already been talked about. And I will just say that thank you, Alice, for mentioning about the Wild West sort of myth. We see it a lot. The outer space, the moon, other celestial bodies is not the Wild West. One of the earliest announcements, one of the earliest statements from the United Nations was that the rule of international law is active in outer space. It's very much not the Wild West. That's the whole point. We have this discussion on the peaceful uses of outer space. But of course, if you look at the United Nations Charter, we see that peaceful purposes means pretty much as long as you don't go and start declaring war and bomb things in outer space, you're covered. We know that military activity happens in outer space. Blethyn's written an amazing book telling us the history of space exploration is the history of military activity. So when we're thinking about the governance, let's start thinking about the law. And again, Irina's already talked about the legal principles and the ideas underpinning the international governance framework. I sort of think of it in these stages. Articles 1 to 5 of the Outer Space Treaty talk about the basic behavioral principles. You can use outer space if you're a state. You can explore outer space if you're a state. You can't appropriate. You've got to comply with international law. You can't put nuclear weapons up there. And if an astronaut gets into trouble, you've got to try and help them. So the first 5 articles of the Outer Space Treaty are behavioral in nature. And then we come to what I call the accountability triangle. Article 6, international responsibility for national state activity resides with the state, who's got to authorize and continually supervise. That includes non-governmental entities. Don't be hoodwinked when you hear people talk about the lack of commercial supervision or the commercialization of the Outer Space Treaty. It's right there in Article 6. It just falls to the state. So there's the bottom of the triangle. Then you have a creation of a separate category of states, the launching state, which is jointly and severally liable for damage caused to another state by its space objects. And then you have the bottom of the triangle, jurisdiction and control of objects launched into space to which registries attached. So it's this accountability triangle. States are responsible, launching states are liable, and then registration is incentivized because if you register an object, you get jurisdiction and control of it. That's how we keep hold of space objects. That's how we understand their place in the legal sphere. That's going to apply to moon bases. That's going to apply to orbital vehicles. That's going to apply to the vehicles that get us to space. So when we're thinking about that, the nation state is inexorably tied to these institutions right now under the current framework we've got. And I think it's true to say that there's a sort of a widespread acceptance of the Outer Space Treaty. There is discussions as to whether it's customary international law or not. I don't really think that matters at the minute, because I think all of the major players are signatories anyway. And then we hit the Moon Agreement, because the other treaties were sort of, yeah, fine, we'll rescue and return, absolutely not a problem. Liability, yep, we can sort of develop that. Registration, okay, not so many, but enough. And then we hit a roadblock, 4 years, and we get to the Moon Agreement. And the problems come in Article 11, the establishment of an international regime as soon as exploitation is about to become feasible, coupled with a reluctance of states to become tethered to the common heritage of humankind principle. You notice in the Outer Space Treaty, there's no mention of the common heritage principle. It's the province of humankind. Common heritage principle, it ran into trouble with UNCLOS as well. And essentially, the common heritage principle has, I don't want to say it has no fixed definition, but different states interpret it differently. And that's kind of why we don't get adherence to it, because state A thinks, okay, it just means you get access to the benefits of space and the resources, whereas state B might think that means there's got to be equitable sharing where everybody gets a piece of the pie. Those two interpretations are miles apart. And that's where the problem comes, because state A isn't going to give up its sovereign rights to any sort of resources that it gets. And we run into political problems again. So we then come to the Artemis Accords, simple universal principles, said Bill Nelson, that will enable the next generation of international partnerships for the exploration of the moon and beyond. We've now got 21 nations as a part of it. I've listed them there. Saudi Arabia signed yesterday, day before yesterday, I think. And firstly, it's not a legal treaty, it's political commitments. But as Blethyn said, these political agreements are, representative, shall we say, of shared values. They are agreements between nation states. They are part of the conditions of entry to Project Artemis. So it's not an international treaty, but it doesn't half look like one, and it doesn't half feel like one as well. And what is it? Well, we look at the participation on the Artemis program based on peaceful purposes, transparency, interoperability, emergency assistance, etc., etc. I've listed them all there. Now, I think for a large part, there's nothing really controversial in many of the principles that are there. And actually, we've got sort of a statement of extant space law. I think, we're not seeing many dramatic deviations. So the US claim it's simply operationalizing the Outer Space Treaty. I think it's a bit more than that, though. Because I think what we've got is a tacit recognition that securing a meaningful binding treaty isn't practical. And also saying that actually we're going to go and do this. And these are the terms that we're doing it. It moves from arguments in abstract to actual foundational principles. I think it also recognizes a horizontal system of the world order. But I think one of the things that we find is the asymmetric negotiating position. You have the United States here. They've got Project Artemis. And then you have the signatory states there. The price of admission to those lucrative Artemis contracts is adhering to those principles. I also think that actually what we could be seeing is a developing norm for collaborative partnerships. We're seeing these smaller agile agreements between countries. We're seeing, memorandum of understanding being signed between various countries on space activity. And I think that's recognizing that there needs to be recognized declarations between prospective partners. If you're going to engage in space activity, because the price of international trust is so high at the minute, there's got to be declarations between these prospective partners. I also think that the Accords don't empty the options box for more permanent binding measures. So in one sense, I'm broadly optimistic. I think that as a statement, it's not as bad as it could have been. However, I do think there are problems. I think, state activity shapes the legal framework. We can't say that the two are not connected. There is an inherent connection between what a state does and what international law looks like. Okay, political declarations can morph into international law very, very quickly. Now, what does this mean? Certainly regarding safety zones that are mentioned in the Accords, I think there is this problem of asymmetric negotiating positions. Is this multilateralism, or is this imposition based on, you know, as I say, an asymmetric negotiating position? There's talk of transparency and interoperability. Well, they can all be used to leverage commercial advantage. And I think we're also aware that the International Lunar Research Station shows that there is not the, you know, this may not be the only game in town. Are we setting up for, you know, conflict in outer space? And is there a danger of bypassing established lawmaking mechanisms? I've talked about China, you know, China are going to the moon. So where does this leave the moon agreement? Well, I think going back to my original point, we don't know what it's going to look like. We don't know what the infrastructure is going to look like. We don't know how it's going to shape up. But sustained lunar activity is going to shine a light on the moon agreement. If states are opposed to the Artemis Accords, if states think that the Artemis Accords is not the way to go forward, they have the option of signing the moon agreement. Okay, that would then push it into increased prominence. And actually, many of the provisions of the Moon Agreement are simple extensions of outer space treaty principles: exploration and use, peaceful purposes, freedom of scientific investigations. That's not a problem. Article 5 of the Moon Agreement actually embodies transparency, consultation. And you could even suggest, and this is something that I'm sort of tentatively suggesting, that you could construe safety zones from Article 5. You've got non-appropriation in there, Article 11, Section 2. Where the Accords go further is in terms of heritage. I think heritage is a question that might not be significant, but it might be very significant. Are heritage zones going to be de facto appropriation? That's a question I've got. Australia and France have both signed the Artemis Accords and are involved with the Moon Agreement. So I think we've got an interesting dynamic there. Where are we, you know, who's going to jump and in what direction are they going to jump? If there's a conflict. And again, I think the conflicts between the two are overplayed, actually. So just to wrap up, law will emerge from the order. The infrastructure we get, the activity that we get, the institutions that are put in place will dictate the legal mechanisms. I think people and those that are seeking enforcement will continue to be disappointed. You only have to look at the current geopolitics to see states enforcing against other states. It's not happening at the minute. Law is part of the governance jigsaw, but it's not the totality of it. A space lawyer saying that law isn't the totality of the world, what's it coming to? But it's true. The principles of the Outer Space Treaty accepted by all major space active nations. And I think, you know, the Artemis Accords don't deviate from that normative framework. But I think, again, I go right back to what I said at the start. The constitutional questions, the questions of how the institutions are going to interact with Earth, the rights, the responsibilities of those people on the moon. And if you look at the treaties, there's no mention of people. You get astronauts, but they're sort of a hypothetical godlike creature up there. There's no individual mention. There's no people there. And that's going to be the questions we need to address. The value system of participants. Artemis Accords are a start. The discussions we're having here are a start. The question I'm going to pose is, what's missing? What are the values that are not reflected that we think we need to take into outer space? There's some great work going on in UN COPUS, the working group on the legal aspects of space resource activities, co-chaired by my wonderful colleague and friend, Stephen Freeland, is doing some amazing work trying to slowly, incrementally build this consensus. But space at the minute still belongs to them. It still belongs to Apollo. It still belongs to astronauts. It belongs to people with the right stuff. If we're to have an enduring, persistent, reliable, predictable governance system, it needs to belong to us, everyone watching. So we may have a moon agreement in the future, but I'm not sure it'll be the moon agreement. Thank you very much indeed. I hope I didn't go on too long.
Gosh, well, thank you, Chris. There's a lot to ponder there. And even though you said that you were going to be pessimist as well, I still think there's much to take heart from what you've been speaking of. And I think your point about the values is absolutely crucial, and identifying what's missing as well. So with all of these thoughts in our head, I would like to welcome our fourth speaker for this evening. I'm very pleased he's able to join us. That is Professor Dean Sanders, who's a Worimi man who's been awarded an Order of Australia for his outstanding contributions to the developments of professions and consumer trust. He's had a very illustrious history in government and regulation, and now he's in the space world, and he's leading ethics and professionalism for Deloitte, and has been making some really valuable contributions to how we think about space and our future in space. So I'm so happy he's here. Dean, I don't know if you have any slides that you'd like to share.
I don't, Alice. I'm going to go with the non-slide version of engagement tonight.
The floor is yours, Dean.
Thank you, Alice. And thank you for the invitation to come and speak. And thank you for those earlier conversations from our speakers. It's been fascinating and interesting to listen to that sort of journey through the whole process. And in fact, you may or may not be happy to know that you've radically changed what I was going to speak to tonight. Alice mentioned the sort of, a version of my life that focuses on the sort of corporate and regulatory spaces, but that doesn't wholly speak to the fact that that a large part of my life is also and has always been in relation to the issues of culture, Indigenous culture, First Nations culture, Australian and Aboriginal culture, which some of you will know is the world's oldest continuing culture, which informs pretty much everything that I do and think about in relation to the world. And I began thinking about tonight's conversation as a version of conversation about governance, and I will talk about that as a version of issues of law, but our speakers have traversed that territory very profoundly, and I don't need to step into it. And what I think is, in fact, just the reason I don't have slides is because I've thrown those slides out based on the fact that I'm listening to those conversations, and we'll go, I think, with just a conversation, a yarn, as we call it in the context of an Australian Aboriginal culture. Because I think when Chris throws that provocation to us about values, throws that sort of challenge to us about who we are, it naturally triggers something for me. It triggers something for me, I think, as it does trigger for many people from First Nations cultures, from Indigenous cultures, that, and in the language of law, also, LAW, it triggers something about the way we understand the world that is particular, which I think, Bethan did a great job of understanding or explaining rather the relationship between politics and law, as though those two things are indeed indivisible. For us, though, for Indigenous peoples of the world, not just Aboriginal Australians, I just want to start off by that sort of recognition that I'm joining tonight from my country, which is, I'm up on Darkinjung country, I'm Wanneroo country. I'm a Worimi man, which is just slightly further to the east from here, but I live up on this country in very sacred space. I'd love to show you outside for the moon tonight, but it actually is raining and cold. Otherwise, I'd take you outside and show you. But just over there, just over to my left, over a little ridge that's on the other side of my property there, is a very sacred country, very sacred mountain. In fact, in that sacred mountain, Yengo, it's called up here, on that very sacred mountain, our creator being stepped from that mountain into the stars. In fact, he's up here on that picture behind me. I won't ask you to peer into the screen to see if you can work it out, but that painting behind me is in fact a depiction of the sacred country up this way. And I'm referencing that for you only to say that when we connect in conversations like this, especially global ones, we often forget our physical connection, our geographic connection, our terrestrial connection, our relationship to each other. This idea that we are connected to the country. In my language, we talk about acknowledgement of the country. In my language, we talk about the idea of my language, the Gatang language. We talk about the issue of Nirabara, which is our mother, our relationship to this planet. But what's really important, and Chris just challenged that a little bit earlier too, in a beautiful way, is that our Earth doesn't sit in isolation. Our mother doesn't sit in isolation in space. We are part of that system of relationship to space. The moon is part of our relationship. It is in fact not just I think a celestial sister, I think was the language that that Chris used. But for us, there is something much more powerful even about the idea that we are in direct relationship with the moon, we're in direct relationship with space. Everything that is up there is down here in terms of life and politics and story and law. Yes, LAW as well as LORE, which is the way we understand and communicate our cultural obligations through law. But so we call it Earth Camp, we call it Sky Camp. We call those two things being in relationship to each other. It is a mirror of our life here. Sky Camp, everything up there is down here. And I just reference that to you because the conversation about the moon and the concept of governance and the sort of language we heard from Irina, the sort of conversation about politics and law from Bleth, and that sort of framing of Artemis and other issues that Chris put forward, all of that positions the moon as a resource, as a relationship, as something from which we extract, something that exists, something objective, something that sits out there in space. But what if the moon isn't a resource? What if the moon isn't a thing? In our culture, the moon is agentic. It's an entity. It is in direct relationship with us. It's not a thing, it's not an object. It's family. It's something that tells us story about who we are. And in fact, not only is it directly family, it has a direct relationship to it and describes many of our obligations to each other. For many of you who don't know, if you're in the Northern Hemisphere, you'd be quite familiar with the sort of language of the moon as being female, and the sun, because of our, paternalistic, patriarchal systems of power that have dominated this globe for so long, the sun being this dominating, powerful agent that traverses the sky. Down here, it's the opposite. Down here, in fact, the sun is a woman and the moon is a man. But importantly, there's a reason for that power shift. And the man is in relationship to the sun, because in our cultures down here, women are the ones who have that power. In fact, they are and not surprisingly, if you think about the idea of country and the concept of creation, the capacity for creation, we're a pretty poor, men are a pretty poor participant in that particular exercise. Women have power, extraordinary power for the concept of creation. And so the sun has that power in terms of that sort of issue here. And the moon, in fact, is a male who is Balu in my culture. The sort of Eastern New South Wales cultures talk about him as Balu. Balu being a man who, in fact, is ashamed because he has done wrong. And so he changes his face. His face shifts and changes through the month as he turns his head in shame in response to the sort of inappropriate behaviors that he took place in. Now, without going into the gory details of that particular story, that's a story, in fact, about the idea that whilst the moon is a man, even that male relationship is described in relationship to women, described in relationship to our duties as men in the concepts of society and how we have obligations and responsibility in that context. Now, that might sound like just an irrelevant cultural sort of conversation, but I'm sharing it with you because the conversation I've heard so far, and Chris challenged us all to think about this too, which I really appreciate. This idea that somehow this space thing is an objective irrelevance or an objective difference, something differentiated from who we are. In fact, it's in relationship to us. It is directly in relationship to who we are. It informs us. We are taught our stories of maleness, our stories of femaleness, our stories of who we are and the way we work, the relationships we have to our terrestrial spaces, to our mother here, are informed by those conversations. And that's a power in Indigenous cultures. That's an issue of governance. It's an issue of responsibilities, which is the way we understand the world in Indigenous cultures. We don't have language of rights in Indigenous cultures. There's another thing to come into in relation to, yes, I'm trained as a lawyer, I've spent most of my life in that sort of field, but I'm particularly interested more so in the way we understand law as a concept of obligation, of responsibility. Irina gave us a great sort of a set of examples about the idea, the optimism of law, that law is in fact somehow a way of describing the way we want to navigate our world, where we'll negotiate with each other through that world. And as Bletham rightly called out, his pessimism, if you like, around the idea of law as politics. I have to admit, and without wanting to sound particularly dour, and Indigenous cultures can often be a little bit stoic about this, about the future of our planet as we spend our desperate waking hours attempting to destroy it, that in our cultures, I'm not so optimistic about the power of law as it's described in Western systems, because law is an excluding construct. It's a prescribing construct. And usually that prescribing is done by those people in power. We heard that sort of conversation already, that it's those people with power, with the pen, who are able to construct and prescribe the future for others. So I do tend more, I've got to say, to Blethen's perspective, that we have all the examples we can need, frankly, in the current markets, in the current environments, the current models of satellite deployment and state use of power in space, to give us great concern about how space will be misused, even when it sits within the law, even when operationalized well within the law. That's not necessarily the right way of understanding it. So I want to talk a little bit about, picking up on Chris's point at the end, more about the idea of governance, understanding governance, using the language of responsibility as we describe it, rather than the language of rights. Governance is, and I think this is a great sin, a great problem in the way we've misunderstood the power of law, the power of language in constructs of law. I think the world is obsessed with languages of rights. And I say that, by the way, as somebody who operates in the human rights space and who is involved in the dialogues around UNDRIP, or United Nations Declaration of Rights for Indigenous Peoples, all the elements that we understand the way we think about rights, that space have rights. Rather than frame the language around space having rights, or the moon having rights, or individuals across the globe having rights to space, we think about it from a cultural perspective as we have responsibilities for space. So Chris put the challenge about what's our shared value. I would say, what's our shared responsibility? What is each of us? What is our responsibility nationally, individually, culturally, professionally? What are our responsibilities to those challenges? I think it's very interesting, as I want to work through us with the idea of the Moon Agreement, the 18 state parties. I don't, if I can do this now because I now work in the world of professional services and I'm relatively a free agent, having spent most of my life around government. I'm not wholly confident that governments know what they're doing, or that they are certain about the intentionality beyond the current cycles of politics, the current cycles of economics. Certainly not. In my language, we have this concept called Marbulavu, which is next 7 again, which is the idea that we have a responsibility to the next 7 generations, that every decision I take today, every question I respond to, every project and consideration I take in, I have responsibilities to the next 7 again. Importantly, by the way, is the word again, not just the next 7, because that next 7 will have another next 7. And that next 7 will maybe be, in fact, disconnected entities of my own making. They will be me through water, through kangaroo, through tree. There'll be our relationships to the system at a whole. It's not just 7 generations, but 7 generations again and forever. Imagine if we were setting up systems of governance around the moon or around space generally, where we took that level of consideration into it. That the decisions we take today around things like Artemis, or frankly anything, I'm not as enamored of Artemis as others are either, because it is insufficient to the complex challenges we ask ourselves about the future of our relationship to space. And I'm not optimistic, because I see that being played out. I see in our culture, we talk about in governance, what we seek to do in governance is we govern our relationships, we govern our responsibilities. We don't prescribe or proscribe. It's not what is right or what is wrong. It's actually about saying we have a responsibility to the system, to the health of that whole system, which includes space, which includes our moon, it includes Balu. We have responsibilities for the systemic health of that entire environment, and anything that detracts from that systemic health, our planetary health, our personal health, our collective health, leave aside our systemic space health, is in fact a failure of that system and needs to be discouraged, which is our language of governance. So you see the language of commerciality and competition that goes on in space, and it is something to despair about, I think. Our culture spends all of its time, many of you will have heard of story. I mentioned Balu, the story around Balu, which I can't share for you because it's a powerful story, but I will just reflect. It's a story as an example about the power of women, the importance of responsibility of men in relation to our ongoing duties to each other. That's a conversation about attempting to limit greed and limit narcissism. Our culture focuses on those two things. Frankly, I think all sins of the world in every form of religion are examples of those two sins, ego and greed. And we see ego and greed being played out in space. As far as I'm concerned, that's all I see out there, be it state, be it military operating in its own right, be it commercial enterprises. I just see ego, I just see greed. Those are behaviors that we see in children in our culture, that we govern, we educate, we engage with to remove. And I think we have a job to do. Chris put the challenge out there. So who and how do we bring this to the table? Well, it's a question I often ask myself. Who does speak for space? Who speaks for space? Right now, we construct artificial entities like the UN committees. We construct groups, and the general consensus issues. We seek Artemis Accords. We construct these vehicles as ways of engaging in a conversation about who speaks for space. It won't surprise anybody here, hopefully, to know that I think, well, with those people who speak for space are those people who have always spoken for space. Our ancient cultures, our wisdom traditions, our stories, and it won't surprise you, as the world's oldest continuing culture, that I think Indigenous Australia has something to offer the world in this regard. We have told stories about that space. We have told stories about them, and we've sung, we've danced, we've written poems, we have carried law. It's a navigation tools. It's stories of family and ritual. It's stories of ceremony, and all of which is there to protect us from those particular issues in space. And I think that's an important part of us to think about. When we talk about soft law principles that Irina mentioned, we have soft law principles in the way we understand behaviours and govern conduct in those particular spaces. And I just think that the one thing I'd say about those structures of who speaks for space, and it does worry me a little bit, even conversations like this worry me a little bit, because I'm very aware of my privilege in those systems, that we tend to, in the Western constructs of governance, think about representational structures. So the UN committee that Chris mentioned, and I know Stephen, he's a very good man, but still these issues are representational, as though a country speaks for all of its people, or a person speaks for all of a country and all of its people. These are representational models of governance that have proliferated in the West. That's not the way we understand it in cultural contexts like First Nations people in Australia. Governance is relational, not representational. Governance is about those who can speak for it. It's not positional. It's not attached to a title or a position holder. It's attached to a knowledge holder. And maybe, and in fact, perhaps most significantly, the people in this call are knowledge holders. Each of you hold knowledge. That's why you are giving up your time. You're in this conversation because you hold pieces of that puzzle, and that voice needs to be heard. So how is your voice being heard? Is it representational from some person appointed by your government who last Tuesday was doing something else politically, but for this month, their political appointment in some other way? How does representational voice corrode and erode at the heart of relational voice, of knowledge holding voice? I think these are really important questions for us when we go into thinking about space, because so governance isn't just the outcomes of governance like law, soft law, rules, engagement, obligation. They're also the way we construct it, the way we understand concepts of governance. Who is responsible for governance? Who will speak to that? And while we're on the topic of who speaks for space, who speaks for humanity's relationship to space? Chris put that challenge there about how do we have shared values? Well, who does speak for that? Who does speak for that shared humanity? Because it's not there right now. And the point that was made about the global state of our current politics. Who does speak for humanity in that? We have, again, the language we use in our systems is rights-based language. Humanity as a construct of rights. That's not the way we understand it. I don't think it's the way that will succeed either. So who speaks for humanity and their relationship to space? Again, I think it should be something to do with our First Nations cultures. We should have voices in those conversations, and we don't. We frankly don't. They're just not there. We have governments, we have states, we have experts. We don't have the voice of humanity. We don't have the voice of space in those particular conversations. And I'll just finish off by saying that because our protagonist has had all a very dark path in this conversation. It wasn't where I intended to go. I was much more optimistic originally, but I've really been encouraged. And given that the field has been so beautifully covered by our three speakers, I want to come into it slightly differently with you and talk about the idea of that sort of governance relationship as a human construct, as something informed by that, and recognizing the powers of that system that discourage our engagement with that as human beings. There's law to that LORE story. There's law to that LAW. There's governance, there's ritual, there's components of humanity that fit into that piece. I want to know how they all come together. I want to understand how they all come into that particular space and how we begin to describe for ourselves a new idea about what governance even looks like in relation to space, because space is in relationship to us. We are part of it. We are made of it. It's not just something out there distant from us. We are literally informed by it. We are constructed from it in terms of our relationships to both the location and to components of extraterrestrial matter. We are part of it. We are not talking about governing something distant from us. We're talking about governing something that is us. I think that's the challenge that's setting us up there for the future. Sorry, Alice, I'll stop there for a second because I may be taking us all down a very dark path and see how you want to go in that particular conversation.
Everyone has said that they're being pessimistic about the future of space. But I think, Deen, thank you so much for that. I think there's a lot of cause for optimism in what you say as well. And I think it's really interesting to take what our previous speakers have laid out for us and shift the perspective slightly to the issue of relations and relationships and responsibilities and speaking and voice and who speaks what. And I think this brings it back to a personal level, which is why I think everybody is here right now, because we want to hear and understand and develop our voice in relation to space. So thank you very much for those unique perspectives. And perhaps we can feel optimistic in some ways, because I mean, I don't know about you, but I believe people are fundamentally good at heart. They need the opportunity to let that come out. And perhaps some of the structures we're putting in place around space aren't best designed to do that. So that's my thought anyway. Thank you to everyone who has spoken tonight. This has been so many things to ponder, so much new information to process, but now we have some time for questions from the audience. And I know people have been popping things into the chat, so I encourage you to keep doing that. So I'll now hand over to my co-host, Michelle, who will moderate this part of the webinar.
Thanks so much. Thank you, Alice. And thank you, Professor Sanders, and all of our speakers. It's been a fascinating evening. And as one of the co-organisers of even having these discussions, I'm grateful to all of you, and especially Professor Sanders, for raising these points about being in relationship with the beautiful moon and being in relationship with our beautiful ecosystems and cosmos. And how do we all play some kind of role of responsibility in caring for space country? How do we look after place, and how do we look after each other? So we've got a number of questions here. I've tried to group a couple. Some have come through in the main one, some have come to me privately, so I'll just group them together. And because we've had such a lovely variety of discussions, from some of the elements of law right through to, I think, some of the bigger picture ethical issues, we've got some nice range there, so thanks again. So I might start with a question from John. How do we persuade, and sorry, if I think it's for someone in particular, I might flag you, otherwise it's just for anyone to answer. He's asked, how do we persuade the USA, Russia and China to sign the 1979 Moon Agreement? Has anyone got thoughts on that? Yes, please, Chris. And speakers, presenters, please do feel free, just jump in.
This is something I've wrestled with, because as I say in my talk, there's so much commonality in there that I think that, you know, it's rehabilitable. You can rehabilitate it if there is the political will to do so. They've done it with the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. And the way that they manage that is by removing the difficult bits. The difficult bit being Article 11. So I think that's the first thing. The second thing, of course, is that one of the states that were mentioned could just unilaterally sign it anyway. Could just take the plunge and say, right, I'm signing it. You know, possibly a coalition of Russia and China signing the Moon Agreement would then place the USA in a really interesting position, because then you'd have this international instrument that isn't just sort of hovering and sort of on the fringes. It would then be brought into the mainstream. So I think there's two ways it could be done. As I say, I think the Moon Agreement per se is a toxic brand. I think that it's just too much of a jump to get the USA on board. I think, you know, it would require other parties to say, actually, you know what, we'll accept Artemis. Why don't we bring some of the Artemis principles into the moon and have a revivified treaty? That's probably the way that I would think it goes if at all.
Excellent. Thank you. Did anyone of the speakers want to comment on that?
I'll jump in to maybe come at a different angle, Michelle, on that, just to reflect that, Chris is reflecting there, I think, the political realities of that decision-making element. I would say that the way to get agreement making is the same way we have always got agreement making. And by the way, I'm not talking here about the last couple of 100 years where we think we've been making agreements, when in fact, to Chris's point, we've only actually been making trade-offs. We've been seeking consensus and negotiation. That's not actually agreement making. That's negotiation. The way we do agreement making in most First Nations cultures is a recognition that two principles. Firstly, that we are not important. The minute you give away that recognition of ego, that you are not the most important player in that room, the minute you deprioritize your interests and prioritize the interests of space or our shared objective, whatever that is, then that allows decision-making to take place. So the reality that the negotiations won't proceed is because they are in extractive greed. There's an assumption of, I want more than the other, I'm more powerful and important than the other, therefore I get more bargaining power than the other. Don't remember those two sins, ego and greed. They play out even in our governments. So in Indigenous cultures, we would take those out of the mix, but we would take them out of the mix by literally, and this is going to sound a bit cheesy, but it's really important for this conversation. We would take it out of the dynamic by sitting around the fire together, steering into a shared purpose, not sitting across the table negotiating benefits, but sitting with each other, equal, side by side, steering into a shared purpose, the shared purpose in most cultures being fire. How do we tell stories around that fire that is a shared purpose, a shared commitment? Now this might sound again like I'm being cheesy, but I run huge negotiations for large corporates on using those precise tools. It's entirely doable. It's just that we don't want to do it in the context like this with governments at that table, but we want to do it in other settings and large corporates and large government decision making, just not when it comes to international politics, where greed and ego are the two most powerful tools being applied in that negotiation.
Thank you. It actually links to a couple of questions we've had floating through some private conversations to me as well about this idea of legal personhood for the moon, rights for the moon, or obligations for human beings. I wonder, Professor Sanders, would you be able to speak to the notions of I work with Mary Graham, who's a remarkable thinker. I'm sure you know her. And we're working on a book about the relationist ethos and what that would look like if you actually built a foundation of Australian society on these concepts. She talks about the law of obligation and she articulates that. And I hear her and Anne Paulina and many others really challenge these Western notions of rights. I wonder if you could share with us, Professor Sanders, what would it look like if we thought about human governance of ourselves as we are in relationship with the moon? What would it look like if our obligations to the moon were the primary driving force for our governance structures rather than a rights-based or commercially oriented? I know that's a big question, but I'm assuming you've actually thought about this in your work. What does it look like to not be focused on competing rights, but to actually have an obligation? Would we just stay home and not go there? That's partly my desire, but what are your thoughts?
well, we may indeed choose not to, but you're quite right that the language of rights, which we all understand as a natural instinct, what would happen if we give the river rights, if we give the moon rights, if we give nature itself rights at law, but the minute we do that, as you say, we move into a competitive relationship with rights. So whose rights trump whose rights? Mm. That's not a good basis for negotiation. And invariably, by the way, as we have seen frequently in every colonial structure around the world as an example, those rights can simply be ignored and or erased or just forgotten and sidestepped because or terra nullius in our particular case, just to turn that into an adjective of invisibled in the system as occurred for Australia. So rights, I'm not as optimistic about rights. And as I mentioned already, I'm not a rightsist when it comes to human rights constructs. Relational obligation, as my mind, is much more powerful, but you're right, it comes quite loaded. It comes loaded with a different set of relationships and obligations. So the language that I often talk about is imagine mining companies, just for instance, because that's an example of the sort of extractive capacity of the moon and resource usage there. But imagine if mining companies were to instead rather than recognize that they are extracting resources from our planet. That is the job. And by the way, Indigenous people are not wholly against mining rights. We extract as well. We burn, we engage, we're in a relationship. The question is, how do you do so respectfully? How do you do so relationally? How do you go to a landscape, recognizing that that is your mother, treating it like your mother, and saying, I will take this from you, but thank you for giving it to me. That's a profound shift. Imagine that the moon was our father in the context of that. How would you go? How would you extract from the moon in a respectful and relational way? Now, it might sound cute and cultural, but it's not. It comes with extraordinarily loaded depths of consideration. That is our ancestor. How do you extract from your ancestor? The coal in the ground here is our ancestor, literally our ancestors, in terms of trees and other forms of vegetation that informed our society here. The same is true for space. The same is true for the moon. So I think it's not about framing it as rights versus responsibility. It's about framing relationships in their true sense. And the true sense is that if we are in genuine relationship with each other and with every agentic element of our environment, then we have to negotiate that relationship with them and do so respectfully.
Thank you. And it's tough. Obviously, the work we do across Australia, but everybody who's working on regenerative economies and regenerative societies, that whole idea of stopping just pure extractivism and giving back, it brings on a whole new meaning when it comes to the moon. As I think Chris pointed out, when we take from Mother Nature, she has a chance to grow back. Father Moon is a little different and a very different space, very different entity. Okay, so we've got a couple more questions that I've just woven together, for better or for worse. I'm going to jump into a slightly different topic. And if anyone in our little group here tonight has been part of our webinar series since Tuesday, so Tuesday and Wednesday, in the Tuesday webinar, we heard from some really wonderful people, but they were talking very enthusiastically about the commercial industries, the space economy, this idea of all of these companies and nation states scurrying to develop the technology. I mean, this urgent case that they were putting forward to all the stuff that's about to head to the moon. And there was just this real feeling, like I got quite frightened as I was listening to it, like, are we going to look up in a couple of years and it's going to be like watching traffic, and the moon's going to be covered in buildings and billboards and whatever. And then yesterday with Alice's balanced discussion, and today, Bledden talking about really it's not viable. And how do we even look at these, whether they're military or commercial interests, that just the sheer difficulty of getting there and doing all these things. So how do we, as non-space experts, people who love the moon and care about it, how do we understand what's going on when we hear that? We hear private sector commercial interests talking about charging up there with payloads and packaging and smaller satellites and bigger trucks and whatever, versus what we've heard tonight, which is we really don't have the structures there yet. And I think it was you, Christopher, talking about the governance will really follow the activity and what people get up to. I mean, is it one big giant mishmashy mess? Is this commercial imperative these folks have been talking about? Are these speedy processes actually going to happen? Where the heck are we in terms of what's really happening? And if anyone can answer that, I'd be grateful, because there's some really different messaging over the last 3 days.
I can see Bledden has his hand up.
Oh, please. Yes, please just jump forth and
I'm
speak.
happy to get going on this one, yeah, because it's a constant bone of contentment that I have with a lot of enthusiasts about commercial space activities, even in Earth orbit, but including them beyond. And some people go so far as to talk about commercial stuff on Mars. There is a bubble at the moment, so for those not wanting to see any sort of economic development on the moon, yeah, you don't need to panic right now. The discourse is what the alarm is, not the actual activities at the moment, because there are no real significant activities. As Chris said, there is no infrastructure, and it is really expensive still to put stuff on the moon. And the character of the global space economy is still really driven by public spending and governments being the primary customer for private companies doing things with space systems or space technologies. So if you look at telecommunications and imagery from space, or Earth observation or imagery intelligence, the bulk of the clients for that are governments or public sector bodies that rely on government spending to do what it is they do, and that's public services of some kind. Or it's for large companies that need that sort of data, that actually provide infrastructural services here on Earth, which are often heavily subsidized by the state as well. So whilst there is a space economy in Earth orbit, it is not necessarily really commercially driven, or it's not really much of a private economy, because so much of it relies on public spending in one way or the other. And even where you do get some commercial private economy momentum in some areas of Earth orbit, the state and public spending is still part of that mix, because the state, even in the United States, spends so much money on supporting infrastructure that then enables what we could call private commercial activities with satellites in space. Then moving on to the moon, you're almost entirely dependent on public spending, and that is where there's hope then for getting actual input in how the government spends your money, whichever country that you belong to, hopefully in a more representative system, of course, but that is not always the case with every major space power. And there's a lot of speculation going on, and there's a lot of Kool-Aid being drunk as well in terms of the emerging commercial lunar economy. It's like, oh, get off it. That's just, you've just read The Expanse or watched the TV show, and you're just running away with your imagination. When we look at a lot of commercial planning, they all want to get a slice of government spending, of our money, taxpayers' money. That's what they're pitching. So if you're in conversation and with looking at commercial activities that actually you might think, hang on, do we actually want this sort of commercial rush to the moon? Ask them, how much does your plan cost? What is your profit model? Who is your customer? And that's when I find a lot of these ideas start unraveling, because they push a technology. Wouldn't it be cool to do something like this? And more often than not, it's often a case of boys and toys. And if you ask them, okay, where's the demand for this? Who's going to fund it? Who's going to pay for it? Who benefits from it? And we come back to where I started, which is, why do you want to do this? And who benefits from it? Who's going to make the money out of this? And why do you want to do this? And when you do that, when you look at the actual costs of getting to the moon, it's just like, there's nothing commercially viable yet. And even with Starship, I mean, looking at Starship, the new heavy rocket from SpaceX, it's not the rocket engine that's going to do it in as a reusable space technology. It's the thermal materials that are supposedly meant to survive re-entry. Lo and behold, as many people said, they are encountering exactly the same problems the space shuttle did in trying to have a reusable orbital spacecraft that you can get to survive the re-entry stresses without having to rebuild the entire thing, which they had to do with the space shuttle. And that cost an amazing amount of money. Sorry, yes.
Can I throw a challenge there, just to the that's of course a very reasoned and sensible series of propositions, but we have also seen, I'm not as optimistic anymore about the natural constraints of economics argument. There are stupid decisions being made on a daily basis by people with money, and you just referenced even one example of them earlier. We see that often, and I don't know, and in fact I think Chris's challenge is a really important one, that I'm no longer sure that it is governments that have the governance control in this system anymore. And that's a genuine, terrifying risk, that is no longer about politics anymore, no longer only about politics and states and the constructs of formal law, as Ronnie was talking about. There's something else going on. And it's also, just another small point to that, is that it doesn't actually, what is increasingly the case in my view, is it doesn't matter whether in fact these missions and or massive constellation launches are successful. It matters that people are thinking they are successful. It matters that the marketplace thinks there is opportunity, because that generates its own momentum in different ways. And people begin to compete with themselves on fictions, but nonetheless throw things into space. So I think we're seeing that. I think we're seeing people race to launch things because they think other people are racing to launch things. And that shifts the entire dynamic of this approach. And it worries me. It worries me from an Indigenous perspective because we are losing our lore, we are losing our story, we are being blocked from our stories and blocked from our knowledge. It should worry all of you because it's disconnecting our humanity and our relationship to space, but all the crap, we've got Dr. Space Junk on the call, all the rubbish that's being thrown up into that sort of atmosphere. I'm not optimistic about the fact that there'll be some cooler, wiser economic heads who'll slow down that decision. I only see escalation.
It's interesting. I actually agree with both of you. I think what Bleden's saying is, what I'm hearing is this sort of this dissonance between the excitement of the commercial markets and the reality of what's really going to happen. And then what Professor Sanders is saying is certainly what we were hearing on Tuesday, this idea that this bubble of excitement with boys and their toys is building its own reality. And for someone like me who just wants to open up these conversations and support Indigenous peoples in their aspirations to care for place and the stars, how do we understand what's really going on? And look, I think we could talk about this for days, so I might just leave that particular thing there. Thank you very much, Bleden and Professor Sanders, for your input to that. I know that we're just about out of time, but we've got a question for Irina and Chris from Alice. And Irina, I think you may have started answering it in the, I think you guys have been having your own little conversation in the text boxes, but could I put it to you anyway? So Alice has asked Irina and Chris, and this was in the context of the language used to try to express, it could be shared values, or it could just be trying to rein in people's greed. That's my optimistic view. Why is the common heritage of mankind seen to be more objectionable than the common province of mankind? And maybe Irina and Chris, this could be a nice way to talk about the language used in some of the space instruments about trying to do things for the well-being of all or the interests of all. Chris, Irina?
So maybe I will start if Christopher does not mind. I have already mentioned in the chat that sometimes people, just common people, forget about the general meaning of the whole article or of the whole treaty. And when we talk about the phrase like provision of mankind, we use this phrase exclusively only when we talk about that, about the space activity, that the use and exploration of outer space and blah 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 is the province of all mankind. We have this phrase not only in Article 1 of the Outer Space Treaty, but we have the same phrase dedicated to the.
Oh no.
We've frozen.
Irina, can you hear us?
Oh, what a shame. I'm sure she'll come back.
Perhaps. Would you like me to jump in?
Yeah, Chris, jump in and then jump out again.
I will do that. I will do. It's very.
No, just jump in.
The province of mankind, or the humankind, the expression in the Outer Space Treaty was deliberately designed to be vague. It was deliberately designed not to have connotations of resource sharing or right sharing or anything like that. The common heritage of mankind principle is a very specific, recognized principle of equitable sharing, equitable ownership, and it has, as I say, these numerous interpretations. Depending on which scholar you buy the paper from, you'll get a different definition, and I think that's the problem in the age that I'm very conscious of giving up sovereignty in international treaties. Our own country has decided for some insane reason to stop being part of a wonderful organization in the interests of this nebulous concept of sovereignty. But this notion that common heritage could have an impact upon the ability of a state to distribute or to use resources in a certain way, I think gives it a loaded perspective, whereas the province of humankind is a much more vague, much more aspirational, open to interpretation.
But given that both the Moon Agreement and the Outer Space Treaty have benefits sharing provisions, so if you're going to, like the US does, if you're going to say, well, yes, go Outer Space Treaty, you are still obliged to share things. What is it about so is it the vague, I mean, they don't like that part either, do they? Anyway, I should shut up. Now I'm thinking.
You're dead right, Alice. You're dead right, because it's in the Moon Agreement where they go into details of what the sharing looks like. That sharing looks like an international body designed to distribute, and that's where it comes in. That's where it comes into very much to the gaze of the State Department. Whereas in the Outer Space Treaty, it's a much more vague and much more unfettered description. In the Moon Treaty, it's Article 11, subsection 5, which says there's going to be a body set up as soon as it becomes relevant. This body will be in charge of distributing, and that's where the problems come.
Right, thank you. Now, so many things fall into place. It does look like, unfortunately, Irina's connection has dropped out.
I know, I feel so bad because we asked her a question last and we should have asked her a question first, but that's okay. We've enjoyed her talk, and she did write some answers in the chat too for those who are interested. To be a good timekeeper, we are officially out of time. Perhaps I might just wrap up by saying I'm really grateful to everybody for all of these sessions we've had, the 3 discussions. For me, it's not the end, it's the beginning. The Australian Earth Laws Alliance is really trying to nurture relationships between people and between the living world and the human parts of the living world to explore how we care for things better and how we do better. So I hope to connect with all of you again in the future. I have so many more questions. I could talk to you chaps and chapettes for many, many days on end. So I'm sure Alice and I will find some more reasons to bring you back together and have a chat. There's so much we can learn from the governance mistakes we've made on planet Earth that I hope that we can perhaps avoid trashing our beautiful moon and other cosmic neighbours. That would be nice. But look, a huge thank you to all of you, especially our audience here in Australia as well. It's now 9 o'clock in Brisbane. And huge thank you to our beautiful guests from overseas as well. It's been so exciting hearing your views, opinions, and very lovely accents. And a huge thank you to Professor Sanders for really bringing in the depth of connection and the importance of relationship and caring for our beautiful cosmos. Alice, did you have any final words you'd like to just leave us with, and then we'll say goodnight?
Just to say that thank you so much to Irina, Blaven, Chris, and Deen. Each of you has brought some fascinating and critical insights to this discussion, and I think as a collective, I have certainly got so much out of this, and I hope everyone in the audience does too. So thank you so much for your time in joining us, and please watch this space. Apologies. I'm sure Ayla and Michelle and I are going to cook up some more plans.
Absolutely.
So we'd love you to be part of those plans.
Absolutely. Thank you again, everyone, for your time. We really appreciate it and respect it. See you again soon, I hope.
Thank you much for everyone.
Oh, are you back? Is that Irina? Oh, thank you, darling.
Yeah. Sorry, I didn't understand, but my laptop was turned off, and I decided to re-enter it. Sorry.
Oh, thank you, Irina. We really appreciate you joining us, and sorry you dropped out. We'll see you all again very soon. Thank you so much.
See you. Bye-bye. Thank you. Bye.
Bye, everyone.